In every heartache, there's a hidden seed of strength. Join Portia Booker on the Grief Grantor as we journey through stories of resilience, finding gratitude in the echoes of grief. Together, we transform sorrow into strength, pain into purpose. Welcome to the Grief Grantor, where your healing journey begins.
Oh, and of course, I'm on mute. Well, good. There we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Grief Grantor. I hope that everyone is doing amazing. You know, I had what I like to call a seasonal moment this morning before I started doing this show. And for some of you who have been following my journey since 2017 are aware that March is a very pivotal month in the journey of Portia. Something that happened to me in March of 2017 was I made the transition from my dream career, which was when I was a TV producer. And I can be honest and say that pivot and that transition in my journey really hurt me for a long time. And I know that's something we don't really talk about in our society, is how grief is not just the physical transition, but also when we make pivots in our career for the best thing for us, right? At that time when I was working my dream job, I was experiencing a lot of mental wellness obstacles. And I had reached a crossroad where I had to make a decision. I had to make a decision on whether I wanted to stay here and try to make things work, knowing that it was crippling and killing me at the same time, or I had to really have that heart to heart with Portia and say, hey, let's let this go for now. But if it's truly meant to be for you, it will make its surface back to you, right? And I think that when we are in seasons of grief, we like to, in a sense, when we move on, we let go, right? But I think we have to remember that when we move on, we don't have to let it go, right? There's still that passion. There's still that drive for us to attain that level of love that we put into a person, a job, a relationship, a place that's still present in our life. So I want each and every one of us to ask ourselves this question today. Am I willing to move on from something that really meant a lot to me? Or am I able and open to moving with this new pivot and honoring it by placing that love energy into another endeavor? Let that sink in. So we're going to take our first quick break right here on the Grief Grantor. And when we come back, we are going to be joined by a very special guest who is going to enlighten us on how moving on does not mean letting go. So we'll be right back here on the Grief Grantor.
Hey everyone, Coach Greg here from Living Empowered TV, where we help women live empowered lives through amazing guests, life hacks, mental, physical, and emotional health. See us on the Achieve Network, 12 o'clock Wednesdays Pacific time on E360 TV. Don't miss out.
All right, everybody, welcome back right here on the Grief Grantor. As I mentioned before we went to break, we are joined by a very special guest who is going to teach us how to, even though we may move on and want to let go, we don't necessarily have to. So welcome, Gina Moffa, to the Grief Grantor. How are you, Gina?
I'm well, Portia. How are you? Thank you for letting me be a part of this with you.
Gina, I'm truly honored. I know that we've been trying to coordinate this for quite some time, but you know, life happens, right? And we just move with it as we do with our grief journey. We incorporate it into our everyday. So Gina, I'm just going to dive right in. Something that really I've thought of since I knew we were going to have this conversation, considering the world that we live in, where there's this understanding or notion that therapists have to keep the 10-man suit on, right? I'm curious, Gina, what did it take for you to grant yourself permission to write your book, Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, a modern guide to navigating loss?
Well, I thought about it for a long time before I submitted a proposal. But, I see clients who are going through grief and different types of losses all day long. And, there are a lot of really great books out there on loss. And yet everybody has a different book that will speak to them. And, so you can buy, I don't know about you, but I buy 6 or 7 books at a time on a topic, sometimes if I can, or if I'm at the library, just so that I can have different perspectives and find myself in them. And one of the things that's always been really powerful to me was the idea of a memoir and sharing our stories. So I've always gravitated towards memoirs, but also as a therapist, knew that I wanted to help younger people. A lot of my clients are emerging adults, and so this is a new population of people who started going through more loss during COVID. And so I had people calling me all the time. I need, I want to work with you. And, you only have so many hands at a time. So there were so many different angles to wanting to write this book. It was, sharing some of my own story of loss so that people would understand that a grief therapist has also been around the block and dealt with, their own loss, to have access to more of a specialized grief framework and tools to help you through it if you couldn't afford therapy or you don't have access to it in some way. And, and also just the idea that sharing some of my clients' stories over the years could help somebody feel a little bit less alone in whatever they're going through. And that was really my hope. But sharing my own story was really the trickiest part, because as a therapist, we're not taught to share much about ourselves, right? It's about holding up the mirror to someone and helping them investigate. And yet, I do think that there are times that, and there are times that it's really important to show who we are and to show that we've been there, that we understand, that we've, experienced this too. And it's a humbling experience to be a grief therapist who goes through loss and completely, is not standing at the top of a mountain with a victory flag, but can be taken down by loss too. And I think that makes it feel as if we're in it together and that there's no grief authority, so to speak. And so that was really kind of what led me to finally, start the process of writing the book.
Gina, what I loved about what you just said is showing people who you are beyond wearing the therapist badge, right? Because you are human too.
Yeah. Yeah.
You experience loss. You experience transition in your own career as a therapist. And I'm curious, Gina, as you were working on this memoir, right, what was maybe one of the challenging pieces for you as far as crafting this memoir around your own journey of loss, but also considering other pieces to the story that may or may not be effective for whoever picks up your book?
Yeah, I think because now it's not actually called a memoir, it's called prescriptive nonfiction. And so they always have these different, names for things. But, sharing my part of it was important, but I wanted to share the parts that felt like they could be helpful. So I start my first chapter out talking about something called a grief fall. And it was the moment that, I had been with my mom, taking care of her along with my dad, for say a 2-week period that she came home for home hospice. And I needed to go back to the city. We live about 50 miles from the city, New York City. And I needed to go back to do something, get payroll for my staff. I was going to be very quick. And I go, so the next morning I'm leaving to just go to the office quickly. And I call my dad to let him know I'm going to run to the office. I'll be 5 minutes and I'm going to be on the next train. And I wanted to let him know what train I was on. So I called, how is she? She's awake. Everything is stable. Okay, I'll be on the next train. This is the time I'll be here. Great. I'll see you soon. I hang up, and no sooner do I hang up that I get a call back about 2 minutes later that she had died when my father came to pick up the phone to talk to me. So I never got to really say goodbye. And getting that phone call and being on a New York City street corner, my whole life just fell. And I call it the grief fall because it's a moment where you feel like you're free falling and you don't know where you're going to land. You don't know if you'll land. You don't know what it will feel like to land. You just know that nothing is ever the same. And that is a universal human experience, whether it is through a death call, a diagnosis, somebody breaking up with you. We all have this moment where we just leaving a job our dream job, we know that we're not going to be the same, that nothing could ever be returned to the way it was. And it felt important to have a term that created a visualization for that. So my first chapter talks about that sensation of falling and my own experience where I really just could not land for quite a while. It became a physical experience of grief. I got really sick physically, and it felt important as a teaching point because we often think of grief as a purely neck up emotional experience. And we don't understand that it is a full body spectrum of experiences. And you will be more physically affected a lot of the times than you can anticipate or that you plan for, or that can take you by surprise. And so it felt important to me to share how that grief affected me, so people can be aware of all of the ways in which it can manifest, and also, the clumsiness of grief. We think that even if we read books or we talk to people or we go to a support group, that this is the recipe. It will be very clear from here to here, and we're going to get it right, and it's not. It's messy. It's clumsy. And sharing that as somebody who worked for well over a decade at that particular time in trauma and grief work, felt important to share, hey, like if I can screw this up, that's a higher bar that I hold myself to. Like, we're golden, it is just a messy experience. So keep the expectations of how you get through this and how graceful you should be or how strong you should be. Just wipe those out.
Gina, we're going to take a quick break right here on the Grief Grantor because I want to ask you another question around this, but I want to take a break to give our audience just a minute. So we'll be right back here on the Grief Grantor, everybody. We'll be right back.
Are you ready to illuminate your path and embrace your true purpose? Welcome to the Secrets of Being retreat in the breathtaking landscapes of Costa Rica. Experience a life-changing journey, surrounded by the vibrant energy of nature. Make connections with like-minded visionaries and change-makers like yourself. Discover the power of love and light as we dive into transformative workshops, guiding you to unlock your highest potential and radiate positivity. Connect with the wisdom of the earth, immersing yourself in the beauty of Costa Rica. Let nature inspire your journey of self-discovery. Awaken the visionary within, and let your light guide you to create a positive impact on the world. Join us at the Secrets of Being retreat and shine bright. Reserve your spot now and take the first step towards a purposeful, inspiring life. Embrace the secrets. Embrace your light. Embrace your being.
All right, everybody, welcome back right here on the Grief Grantor. We are joined by Gina Moffa, and we were just having an amazing conversation about what a grief fall is and kind of the inspiration behind Gina's book, Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. So, Gina, before we jump into the next part of the show, if our audience wants to connect with you and learn more about your work, is there a website or social media handle you can share with us today?
Absolutely. You can find me on my website at ginamoffa.com. And I'm on Instagram regularly. It's my community. And it's at Gina Moffa LCSW.
Excellent. Gina, when you talk about a grief fall, I feel like mine came later on after my mom made her transition, because this year will be 2 years since her transition. And I want to talk about, and maybe you can answer this, when anniversaries resurface, right? And I'm not sure how long it's been for your mom, but when people experience anniversaries of their loved one's transition, how are maybe some techniques that they can either just give themselves permission to still experience that grief fall, or when they find themselves in that boat, how can they give themselves some grace during that period? Because as you mentioned, grief can be messy, crazy. So what are some tips or maybe some ways people can show themselves some grace, especially during anniversaries of their loved one's transition?
Sure. It's such a hard time because these anniversaries in a lot of ways can take us by surprise, even if we're not necessarily surprised that the day itself, um, is coming. And so the emotional experience or the physical experience can be something that we don't anticipate. So I always say that planning ahead if we can, planning ahead is a really important thing to do. And planning ahead means, how do I want to actually use this day that I know is coming up? Do I want to do something special for myself, like take a spa day, take the day off of work? Do I want to spend it with really good friends and have dinner? Or do I want to also use it to honor my loved one who's passed and, do something that they enjoyed doing, or sit in silence and look at old pictures? Or do I want to write them a letter? Do I want to visit the cemetery or their gravesite, or spend time, talking to their urn, like I know some people do? And so to me, it's asking yourself, how do I want to use this day? So that grief doesn't take control of it, right? We're not giving grief and the emotional experience the power here. We're giving love the power. And when we use love as our guide and our navigator in this way, we can say, how do I want to do this? Additionally, if you want to do nothing, to give yourself permission to take the day off from grieving, to take the day off from feeling a lot, watch Netflix all day, watch movies, cook, eat, snack, play with your pets, take a walk, anything that feels like it's just going to be good for you. I think one of the things is we have anticipatory fear over that sense of grief. And so many times, right, the anticipation is so much harder than the actual day itself. The day will come and it's just a day. And all we have to do is just have a day. We don't have to have a good day. We don't have to have a meaningful day. We don't have to have a special day. It doesn't have to be powerful. We can just get through the day and have a day. So it's really about getting to know what your needs are. And it can be different every year. It could be different for every anniversary, every birthday, every day of meaning. You could do something different. It's just about looking at the calendar sometimes and saying, okay, I see that this is on a Thursday. I might take the day off. I see this is on a Thursday. I'm going to see if there's any friends around who can meet after work. Or, it's sort of about that preparation. And if it takes you by surprise and you wake up and you're like, I feel so off. Oh, it's the day. Then I say, take it down a notch, take care of your body. All you have to do is drink enough water, eat enough protein, talk to someone who loves you, get your face in some sunshine, fresh air, move your body and get some rest and just get through the day.
Gina, when I think about my mom's transition, one of the things that I've incorporated in my schedule now is to block out the week of her transition, even with my father, because I notice that I start to feel the physical effects because my body remembers, oh, by the way, Portia, this is mom's, anniversary of her transition day. So we're going to start feeling the heaviness in your lungs. It's going to start feeling hard to get out of bed. So I've designated my mom's transition day as a holiday. Same thing with my dad, where I can just cook their favorite meal or listen to their favorite music or, something to honor them, to ease the heaviness of the grief.
So good.
And I'm curious, Gina, something that I think about, because we have this in common where we've experienced the transition of our moms. When you think back to the day of your mom's transition, and even now, however many years it's been for you, what's a way that you give yourself grace and not hold on to so much grief because you didn't have the opportunity to send her off in the way that you would have liked to?
It's tough because I think I'm still human, right? So I think that every year so far, it's now been 7 years. So it's every year has felt a little bit different, and it still feels like a really heavy day. Um, and I haven't necessarily gotten to a place where I celebrate the day, so to speak, but I used to ruminate, right? So I used to ruminate over all of the woulda, coulda, shoulda on this day. It was like all of that fear and sadness and regret, that I had for those last couple of days of not knowing necessarily how to take care of a dying person because she was in home hospice, but our home hospice nurse got bronchitis and never came back. They never sent anybody else. So it was really my father and I was like, I don't know what to do. Like we followed some directions, but looking back on it now, it's like, wow, I wouldn't have probably tried to get her to take pills if I knew that she was going to die because she couldn't really swallow anymore. And so there were a lot of things that I regretted over these years. And I think, kind of being really gentle and loving with the rumination that comes up because I know that I'm not alone and kind of replaying sometimes those last moments in the last day. And it can happen, the first year. It could also happen 8 years later. It could happen 20 years later. But I think the grace to say, we only know what we know at the time, and we do the best that we can do with the knowledge that we have at the time. And if I had different knowledge, I would have done things differently. And yet I was still a daughter who was holding on for dear life to my mom. I would have done anything to have her not die, and yet I didn't want her to suffer too. So it was a really powerful time of trying to put myself out of the equation. And yet after she died, that's what we think about. What could I have done differently? What could I have done better? Could I have been a better daughter? And so now I think as the years go on, I spend more of the year talking to her, loving her, sending love, doing things I know she would love to do. And so when that day comes, and it just came in this past December, I didn't celebrate the day, but I celebrated our love and I celebrated our relationship. And I continued that bond in that way. And I didn't ruminate this particular year. So that was positive. But it's different. Yeah, it's different every year.
I agree, Gina. This will be year 2 for my mom, and we are coming up on year 1 for my father. And it's been definitely different. I remember the first year of her transition. I remember waking up just feeling off. But then throughout the day, I just gave myself permission to feel. I remember going to the lake where we did the balloon release for her. And, I remember hearing some of her music throughout the day. And even now, through holidays are definitely a dime a dozen these days.
Yeah.
But something I'm grateful for, Gina, is the traditions that I've been able to hold on to in regards to my mom's transition. So my mom was definitely big on New Year's. So every year now I cook the family's traditional dinner to hold on to that legacy and memory. Like this past year, I made my great grandmother's potato salad that I've never made before from scratch.
Oh, I love that.
I remember, just crying my eyes out in the kitchen making this meal. And I'm curious, Gina, can you share with us maybe a tradition that you still honor, between the love you and your mom had, whether it's a dish, whether it's a book? What's one tradition that you still honor with your mom to this day?
Yeah, my mom, so I'm Italian, and my mom was kind of a traditional Italian cook. And she, her sauce was unbelievable and her food was just so good. And and it's interesting because I don't like to cook. And growing up, she would say, come on, let's do this together. And I'm like, I'm reading, and it just was never my thing. But since she died, I find myself only cooking Italian food on a Sunday if I'm home, or, it was sort of a tradition is Sundays around the table, you have a lot of Italian food in your family. And we have a very small family now. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of losses. And so we don't have that, but I do really, really try to keep up the tradition of making her sauce and making the pasta and putting on Andrea Bocelli and really just trying to sort of invoke the spirit of family and love and the ways in which my mother translated that to us. So it is, they say, the way to a heart is through your stomach sometimes. And my mother really, embodied that.
So Gina, what I'm going to need after we record this show, I'm definitely going to need a recipe list because I love Italian food. So I will
yeah.
take
You got it.
the
And her
recipe.
the meatballs were like this big and it was like crazy. Yeah, she was good.
I mean, wow. I mean, to preserve that level of love through food, right, is truly remarkable, right? Because you get to feel this person's essence in a different sense through the love that they were able to project into a meal. Like, everybody knows my mom loved to barbecue, and my mom taught me how to make her signature ribs. So I've made them a few times. So for me, hearing this is truly confirmation that there's always a way to honor our loved ones, whether it's through food, whether it's through art, whether it's through a book, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad to go ahead.
Oh no, I'm interrupting you because I'm like, and then I get to honor your mom through the recipe that you're going to give me for the barbecue and the ribs. You get to honor my mom through some of the pasta stuff. So what I love about this is that we get to share and keep their legacies alive even wider.
Oh, 100%. Gina, something that just popped up for me is when I think about your book, moving on doesn't mean letting go. It makes me think about how each and every one of us has had a different interpretation on what grief really is or means to us. So I'm curious, Gina, what was your interpretation about grief before the transition of your mom, and how did it change post her transition?
Sure, great question. I've lost a lot of family members, some very suddenly. I went through the loss of a marriage, friendship losses along the way, that kind of thing. So I'm not a stranger to loss and grief. But when I lost my mother, it was as if my entire universe shifted. Things lost meaning. And what I think was very different is that it was always, well, number one, like I said earlier, it was a very physical experience for me. But number two was a sense of being orphaned by a mother. Like I'd lost my mothership and things didn't feel as important anymore. It was like I go to my mother for everything important, everything hard, everything wonderful. I go to her for validation. She's the person I call. And most importantly, and I mentioned this in my book, is she would be the person that I would call when I needed to know what to throw away in my refrigerator or how long I can keep leftovers. And I would probably need that the rest of my life. I trust her far more than Google. And so, there's these tiny little things that come up that were so much more internal. So many other secondary losses with the loss of my mother than, or losses that held so much more meaning to me than the other losses. And not to say that they weren't important or really devastating at times, but with those losses, I would go to my mom, and she would sort of be that loving mothership. And when it was her and I couldn't go to her because the loss was her, it had a new, more devastating, profound effect on me and my life.
Yeah, Gina, I feel that a lot, especially now where it's like our moms were the oracle, right? They knew everybody's last name. They knew this person was related to who. They knew where to go in the store to find the hidden ingredient for something. Like,
Totally.
I always called my mom whenever I had to go to the grocery store because I have squirrel attention span. Like, when I tell you I have squirrel span, I could get distracted by the dark chocolate aisle in a minute. And my mom would be like, okay, make sure you grab this to go on the potato salad, or make sure you grab this seasoning to go on the ribs, or make sure you grab this to go into the banana smoothies. But now it's like, especially when it feels like your world has been rocked and your main confidant has transitioned, it's like you feel lost, like you're continuously swimming in some type of murky water.
100%.
And I'm curious, Gina, how can our audience, after they've experienced the transition of someone very significant to them, how can they learn to be more intentional with where they put their energy after experiencing something like this? Because I think, like what you mentioned, things lost meaning. A lot of things lost meaning. A lot of things don't make sense anymore. So how can people learn to be more intentional with where they do put their energy and time after they've experienced some type of transition so significant?
Yeah. To be honest with you, I think that becoming more intentional after a significant loss is almost involuntary because you don't have a lot of energy. You don't have a lot of wherewithal. You're doing everything that you have to do. There's the pragmatics of funerals and all of the things that come after that. Perhaps it's cleaning a house out. Perhaps it's, understanding the will, whatever it may be. That stuff takes very, very like focused energy. And after that, you then have the emotional part or the physical part that may be coming up. And you also are kind of like, who am I talking to? Who do I want to talk to? Who's reaching out to me? Who's reaching out to me in a way that's effective? And what do I have to do next? And I really do believe that grief does, it's the greatest transformation that we really ever will have, because it sort of picks up the cards and throws them all over the place, and you sort of get to pick up which ones are the most important. And so I want to say that because we are so exhausted and overwhelmed and in a place of trying to figure out how our lives are now so rearranged, in addition to the pragmatic things that we have to get done, as well as potentially going back to work because grief is a luxury, and we have to pay our bills, then, I really believe that the intentionality in our lives is a part of that. And it's potentially a real blessing that we don't see coming, because it shows us what our priorities are, who our priorities are, and it really helps us to clear up what feels the most important and vital in the moment. And I don't think we necessarily have a choice in that, simply because everything is so big and overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Gina. I know for me, after my mom transitioned, it was like I fell off of like Humpty Dumpty. I kind of consider it like the Humpty Dumpty effect. Like all these different parts of me just shattered. And I'm still slowly picking up each piece, but I'm taking more time to ask myself, is this piece necessary now?
Right
Like,
there.
I remember it was the first maybe year. It was the first year after my mom transitioned. And I know it was a couple months. It was a couple months after her transition. I remember being in the dining room and I found her hospital bag with all of her clothes and different things like that. And I remember, Gina, in that moment, just something told me, let it go. Don't hold on to this stuff. And I pitched it. I pitched the entire bag with her clothes, with, just certain things, because I knew that I can't hold on. I don't want to hold on to this memory of her. I want to hold on to the memory that I know of her. Like the very last conversation me and my mom had, I have it recorded on my phone an hour before she transitioned. Like, I got this little voice in my head, Portia, record this. And I got to tell my mom, thank you. Thank you for being my mother. Thank you for keeping your foot up my butt to get me to where I am today. Because my mom was tough as nails being military.
I love it.
You know, and I wouldn't want to call anybody else my mother but you. And she said, thank you, darling. You've been one heck of an advocate for me. And I'm truly honored. So I'll always remember that. And even now, listening to that, sometimes I can't listen to it, but I'm grateful that that's a memory that I'll always have. And so for me, I've learned to be intentional with the memories and things that I hold on to my mom, but I've also learned to be intentional about where I put my energy and where I put my time to.
Yeah. Something takes you up and out of that old way of being, or people pleasing, or thinking you had to do everything and be everything and, have everything, and it has to be now, and everybody matters, and it doesn't.
It definitely doesn't. I think grief really taught me that the societal narrative does not apply when you experience, especially a significant loss as a parent or a spouse or something like that, where it rocks your whole world. So we're going to take another quick break, everybody, right here on the Grief Grantor. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Gina. We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, this is Araya McGarry. I'm the host of Get Celebritized with Araya McGarry, right here Wednesday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on the Limelight Network, right here on E360 TV.
All right, everybody, welcome back right here on the Grief Grantor. We are joined by Gina Moffa, and we're just having a great conversation about how we learn to be intentional with our time after we experience a significant transition in our life. Gina, I want to ask something about one of your posts that you made on Instagram. And I really like this post because I think it really applies to kind of that intentionality. You made a post that mentioned what I wish I knew about grief while I was grieving. And two things really stood out for me in that post was how not to compare our losses to anyone else's, and how people may not be able to show up how we need them to when we experience that loss. And I'm curious, Gina, for our audience, what are some tools that you can recommend which can aid people or individuals who may experience this feeling when they're going on their grief journey? Because I know for me, that was hard for me to really work with, because I didn't understand at the time that just because we have a mutual connection to this person, my mom, doesn't mean that our relationship is the same. So our grief is going to be different.
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah, I think that, because we are such a grief illiterate society, because we have not been taught how to grieve, we ourselves don't know how then to support other people. And we also don't know what we need when we're in grief. And so what we do is very human, but we look for reference points. So we look to see what other people are doing, how they've gotten through it. What are the things that are helping them? And the issue with that is that if Sally down the block goes to a support group and has a therapist, or, is really close with her family and has great friends and a grief community and is doing okay, and that's not something that works for you, and you would rather, read books or talk to close friends, you're going to think, oh, this is taking so much longer. Why is Sally down the block doing so much better than me? And I think that we so often completely dismiss the fact that just what you said, Portia, is that we all have a different relationship to our loss. Our losses hold different meanings. It could be a traumatic loss. It could be something that, we lose someone who was a caregiver to us or someone whose livelihood we depended on. There's a lot of different intricate and individual experiences within a loss that make our losses so unique. And when we compare our losses, it is really a detriment to our grief experience because everyone will have a completely different experience. Some people may have more physical experiences or physical symptoms. Some people like to keep it moving, right? So in my book, I talk about grief rhythms because everyone has a different rhythm. And I talk about 8 that I see in my practice a lot. And, so that we learn to not compare, but also not to judge other people's experiences. If you have to go to a wedding and you're having a great time and you laugh, I'm not going to assume that you're over your grief and that you're totally fine now. You know what I mean? So we have to teach people what grief looks like enough. Grief is also laughing. Grief is in the having fun. Grief is in the crying. Grief is in the anger. Grief is in the numbness and the feeling nothing and the keeping it moving. So comparing it is incredibly detrimental. When it comes to kind of the people in our lives, some people are not equipped to deal with very difficult emotions. And it's heartbreaking, right? I talk a lot about how sometimes we are really surprised by the people who show up for us and the people who don't. And, being able to sort of accept that some people won't be with us on this path doesn't make them a bad person, but it makes them not our person on our path. And it is sad, and right. And then we have additional losses, right? That's another loss that we've just lost because now our friends or colleagues or whoever are not able to actually show up in this moment with us. And that's painful. But I think that we have to sort of hold on to who is there, honor our own experiences, and remember and remind ourselves that it's a very different experience than everybody else's. And, just stick with the people who show up. And, and sometimes we don't know what we actually need, which is one of the more confusing things with grief. So we want solitude, and then we get lonely and we want to be around people. But then being around people is too much and we can't be around people. So we want to be alone. And then we're alone and then we're too alone. And so, and we're hungry, but then we're not hungry enough, grief is kind of, if we can understand grief and the grief experience, it is that it's ever shifting. And I call it a spectrum, and because we're going to run the gamut on how we experience it from day to day, even hour to hour. And so I think having expectations that are too high of both ourselves and others around us during our loss experience can be really painful to us and somewhat, set us back a little bit. Because some people will not be able to show up, and some people can show up surprisingly, people we don't know that well, or, look at strangers. Instagram, for example, look, we met there. We have a beautiful grief community on Instagram, and many are strangers or were strangers at one point who got it, who just understood where we were at, who understood the sense of being immobilized by our losses and the mystery that lives in grief, the sense of isolation and loneliness and confusion and brain fog and, all of that forgetfulness. We get each other. And so it's sort of find your community however you can, even if they're strangers, and stick with them.
Gina, I agree with you. I have created more connectivity with people on Instagram than I have with people who I've known for years who knew my mom, who knew my dad. It's just like there's this collective energy of understanding and respect. Oh, I've been where you're at. I know what it's like to miss somebody. Like every blue moon, when I've been thinking about my mom, I'll post a picture of us in my Instagram story with a song to dedicate it. And I'll get different people who I've never met before who will DM me a heart or a butterfly or something. I'm like, wow. Like, I know when we're in seasons of grief, sometimes getting those messages is too much sometimes. But for some reason, now that I've found this collective tribe of people, they just get it. They just know the right, what I like to call prescription for the hour. No pun intended.
So true. Yeah. Yeah. Very much. And it's surprising, right? I didn't join Instagram thinking that I too could be comforted by people. You know, when you're a grief therapist and you're putting out content, it's usually about the output. But the love and the warmth and the togetherness that is there has been just such a beautiful surprise.
I agree. And Gina, while we're on this topic, I'm curious. You mentioned that we live in a very grief illiterate society. How would you say that social media is playing a role in providing that level of education, but also what else can be done to really impact or provide more grief education where people don't feel like they have to, swim out in the Pacific Ocean on their own?
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I could say has been positive about COVID, in all of the bad stuff, is that it has created an understanding of loss in the totality of what it is. And as in, we've lost more than just, people we love. So many people lost livelihoods and jobs, and there were breakups, and they lost their homes and a sense of identity. We lost a sense of safety. And I think understanding that loss is all encompassing in our lives and that everyone experiences grief has brought Hollywood into the picture. There were so many new shows and movies that really centered around grief. And knowing that this is kind of where we get all of our information is through TV and social media, it's been really, really wonderful to start to see that shift. More people, when I first started my Instagram account, I didn't have a lot of people liking my posts on grief. Grief is a hustle. To sell a book on grief is a hustle still, actually. But, everyone will experience. But I do believe that we are moving in the direction of people wanting to understand more about grief, wanting to understand how to support people in their lives going through grief, and wanting to put a name to some emotional experiences that perhaps they held for a long period of time. Some people come to me and they lost a parent or someone they loved 27 years ago. And now, only now are they starting to feel the effects of grief and want to actually engage and befriend it. As in, society before would say, okay, put on a brave face. You have 3 days. Your bereavement leave is up and you got to get back to work. Let's keep it moving, put on your black lace, as Italians, and then when you're done with the funeral, you take your black lace off. It's these funny traditions, but somehow which society allows. But then there was this convenient stop sign at the end of it that was like, now you've got to get back to life and your grief is over and we're going to treat you like normal. And what I love about social media is that, for those of us in the field, those of us who've lost, those of us dedicating ourselves to educating people, is that we're normalizing the longevity and the foreverness of grief in ways that are comforting and not scary. And there's a sense of being a community and knowing that we don't have to walk that path alone. That is like, oh boy, this is really hard, but okay, I can go to Portia's page or Gina's page or X, Y, and Z's page and feel like I've got this community of people who got me. And that's half the battle. So yes, we are grief illiterate in that none of us still knows how to grieve. But I do think that we're starting to turn a corner where more people are willing to engage with it. More people are willing to talk about it. And more people go to social media to learn about it. So some people may not want to go to a therapist after a loss, right? But they'll go to my page and they'll learn about it. And that's good with me. Great. Therapy is not for everybody, right? It may not be helpful, but if my page is helpful, that's all I can ask for. So I think social media is such a powerful tool and in educating grief and making it approachable, relatable, and soft.
Yeah, I agree with you, Gina. I mean, I've seen so many people engage with me through this show. Like, I've had people DM me, Portia, the show that you did with Lori, with David, with Tony. it really spoke to me because I could relate to what they were saying. Thank you for having this conversation. And I know what it's like, Gina, to want to go to a therapist, but sometimes you're intimidated, right? Because of the different societal pressures and stigma that can go along with it. And so for me, what I really found that helped me a lot during my grief journey was social media, number one. Number two was books. I became a book and podcast junkie after my mom transitioned. Like, the very book that really gave me an insight to how society creates this narrative and how grief looks nothing like that was A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis.
Oh,
That
yeah.
book, my soul mother, shout out to my soul mother, Lisa of Yum Yank Brownies.
Lisa.
She sent me that book in the mail. And when I read that, it really painted a whole different picture for me about grief, because the way that C.S. Lewis depicted the transition of his wife in such a vulnerable way. Like, the one part of that book that still resonates with me is how he says her presence is equivalent, her presence being gone is equivalent to the blue sky. It's everywhere. And it's so true. And I said, wow, if this is really how grief is, I wonder how many people are continuing to put themselves into a prison trying to abide by what society is telling them that grief looks like.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I love that book so much.
One of my favorites. Yes, that's one of my favorites, man. Gina, this has truly been an amazing conversation. I knew this was worth the wait. We're going to be wrapping
I'm sorry.
up. No need to apologize. You know, they always say, save the best things for last, right? Because when it's truly orchestrated and relevant, and when the time allots, it will happen, right? You just go with the flow, kind of like with grief, right? You go with the flow of how you're feeling. If today I'm the waterworks show, which I was earlier today, that's okay. You honor it and you give yourself permission to feel how you want to feel. Gina, before we wrap up for today, again, I extend my gratitude to you for coming on today and sharing your journey, your words of wisdom, and being so vulnerable and generous with your time. I want to ask this last question. One of the things that the Grief Grantor is big on is gratitude, resilience, intention, empowerment, and forgiveness. I incorporated forgiveness as a way to honor the relationship that me and my father had. It took me to forgive him as he was transitioning and showing up for him, even though majority of the time he was absent throughout my life. For our audience, Gina, who's tuning in, how can they adopt a level of forgiveness towards themselves for the things that they did not know during their grief journey in order for them to show themselves grace as they continue throughout their journey of living life with a new transition?
That's a tough one, right? It involves a sense of guilt in some ways, which I think is sort of a really empty and useless feeling because it doesn't lead to anything. But, you know, one of the things I like to do, even with myself, when I get into that place of ruminating and being less forgiving for not, you know, necessarily being there when my mom died, is really separating my story versus what the facts were and taking myself out of it and saying, if Portia were to tell me this story, her narrative versus the facts, what would I actually think about that? What would I say to her? Right? Because if it were her, I would say, you're crazy for blaming yourself. That doesn't make any sense. You only knew what you knew. Here's the fact. And you can't argue with facts. But we change things around when we tell a story about things that have happened. And I think it's really important sometimes to understand that forgiveness lives in the facts, because we can't change anything. And we can't change the things that we didn't know. We can't change the things that people did. We can't change the things we did. But we can learn from them, and we can understand, okay, I'm literally just a clumsy human doing the best I can. And if I knew better, or I could know better, or I could do better, I would have. And I think that's kind of all that we have. It's really, you said it all when you asked me the question, how do we find forgiveness in the things we didn't know better how to do, that we couldn't change? And that has to be one of the hardest things the human experience has to contend with, right? You asked me the hardest question humanity has. And, so even my answer is clumsy, because we tend to like to create stories. And so I guess for me, I would say, look at the story you're creating. Is it about fear, or is it about love? Is it about connection or disconnection? Because if we disconnect ourselves from it, and in a place of not being love and forgiveness, we're disconnecting from the love of that relationship too. And we got to stop the lies.
And you said the facts, right? What is the fact in this current season of my life? This person has transitioned. There's a new pivot in my life. And what am I going to honor with that? And how am I going to pay it forward to?
Yeah. Yeah. And mostly, how am I going to pay it forward with myself too?
Mm-hmm.
We can be
100%.
so hard on ourselves, especially
Gina,
in grief.
that's for a whole nother day. We're not even going to go with that. We're going to, that's for a whole
We'll get that
nother
one next time.
Well, everybody, that was Gina Moffa that you heard from here on the Grief Grantor. Thanks for tuning in, and until next week, everybody, take care.
Thank you for joining us on the Grief Grantor. May the story shared today light your path and guide your heart toward healing. Remember, with every moment of grief, there's an opportunity for gratitude, resilience, and empowerment. Continue your journey with us online and share your own story, because in this tapestry of life, every thread matters.